Thank you very much, Michelle, for your kind introduction. And thank you all for your welcome. I first heard of Donald G. within weeks of arriving in Edinburgh to go to university, and for my first ever experience of Pentecostalism, the Lord led me to the Elim Church. So here I am all these years later, still in Elim. But within weeks, I heard about an Assemblies of God minister called Donald G, who was famous in the city. Now, he started ministering in Edinburgh in 1920. And Maldwin Jones will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he was only in Edinburgh for a couple of years before he was called away to national and international ministry. And in that brief time, in the 1920s, he'd made such a mark that he was still being talked about in an Elim church right at the turn of the 70s into the 80s. So that's really all I can say, other than what one reads, in honor of Donald G. But it is a great privilege for me to be giving the Donald G lecture and to be doing so in the centenary year, the 100th anniversary of Regent's Theological College. I was the principal when we celebrated the 75th. And so it's lovely to be back with you. And I'm hoping for an invitation for the summer, Michelle, where we can party. But we've got, as Colin Dye used to say at Kensington Temple this afternoon, we have to be eyebrows together, and then we can be knees up in the summer. That's enough anatomy for this afternoon. I shall switch from medical to other matters. The title of this talk is 40 Years at Bible College, Reflections and Recommendations. Let me say immediately that I'm going to be using the term Bible College throughout this lecture. I've studied and worked at two colleges that have changed their names, both dropping Bible in favor of either theological, Regent's Theological College, RTC, or theology, London School of Theology, LST. Call me a traditionalist, or simply acknowledge with me that the word Bible is shorter and simpler to say than theological. Anyway, that's what I've decided to do. Another thing I need to say by way of preamble is that my reflections are, of course, based on my recollections. Some of you know that my memory is not always my strongest point. Especially Alison knows that, but I think Jeff is aware of that as well. And those of you, Jeff, who have trodden some of the same path as I have, may remember things a little differently at one or two points. You could well be right and I wrong. I can only beg your mercy. By way of introduction, I think I should give you a brief sketch of my various acquaintances with Bible colleges over the years, if only to convince you that I'm vaguely qualified to give this talk. The title spoke of 40 years at Bible College. This is almost true. I entered Elim Bible College, EBC, as a fresh-faced student in the autumn of 1985, and finally retired from LST when my last PhD student graduated in the summer of 2024. So strictly, we're talking about 39 years, but you'll let me off a year. During that period, there have only been very brief stretches of time when I haven't been involved in one way or another in college life. I've been a lecturer at 4 different Bible colleges. First, Kensington Temple's International Bible Institute of London. Doesn't that sound grand? IBIOL, where for part of the time I was UK director. Then RTC, where, as you've heard, part of the time I was principal. Third, Camberwell Elim's Wisdom Christian College. And finally, LST, where for part of the time I was a vice principal. According to my CV, which I trust a whole lot more than my memory, I have been a visiting lecturer at 15 further colleges, giving individual lectures, lecture series, or whole modules. Away from teaching and leadership, I have served as an external review panel member or sole reviewer at Nazarene Theological College and Battersea Hall College. Also, as chair of the European Pentecostal Theological Association, EPTA, I've offered informal consultancy to a range of Pentecostal colleges throughout Europe, from Spain in the southwest to Russia in the northeast, and from Norway in the northwest to Bulgaria in the southeast. No wonder I retired. This talk is not going to be a reflection on things I would have done differently if I had my time all over again. A, we don't get our time all over again. And B, I guess I tried to do my best back then with the skills and experience I had. In similar vein, it will not be, I did X, but you should do Y. I'm not in your shoes. I cannot imagine the specific challenges you face, and I wouldn't dare to tell you how to do it. Instead, simply dividing the talk into two halves implied by the title, I shall, in the first half, reflections, give thought to things that came and went, things that kept coming, and things that stayed the same. And then in the second half, and having been told that I'm speaking to a mixed audience, I shall offer several recommendations, some arising from those reflections, to, in turn, Elim training generally, and then lecturers, and finally, students, last but by no means least. If you don't fall into one of those categories, Walden, apologies. I hope you find something of interest and value. If not, you can fall asleep, but please don't snore too loudly. Okay, here are some reflections. Things that came and went. There'll be two of these, by the way. I have among my possessions at home just one number of the British Journal of Theological Education, volume 10, number 1, to be precise, from summer 1998. Those of you in similar shoes to mine will know why I might own a single journal number. It's because I had an article published in a journal that I didn't otherwise subscribe to. The article's title is "The Development of Church-Based Training Schemes and Its Implications for Established Bible Colleges." It strikes me as I look back that though I would not have predicted at the time, quite the opposite perhaps, the development of church training center, thing that came and went. Mike still okay? Do I keep going? I can hear odd noises. Just keep going? Okay. Back then, the research I did for the article involved sending questionnaires to, in Elim alone, no fewer than 15 schemes that were formal enough to charge their learners fees. 15. I know I'm rather out of touch with where Elim is these days, and I'd be astonished if there's anything like that number now. You may be interested to know that while it seems I didn't ask the Elim schemes when they had started, my research at the time into Peter Brierley's UK Christian Handbook revealed that there had been an explosion of what he called non-residential Bible colleges in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. From the 1940s to the 60s, just 7 non-residential colleges started. From the 70s to the 90s, 42 started. Now, Peter Brierley was looking across the denominations. 15. However, while 13 of the 15 Elim local schemes completed and returned questionnaires, which for anyone doing questionnaires is a very good return rate, their answer showed that 5 had closed and only 8 were currently running. Such schemes were already discovering that in order to have a sufficiently large pool from which to gain new students, you had to start attracting students from other churches, which rather undermined a philosophy of training for the local church, in the local church, and by the local church, which was being talked about a lot at the time. Unless you were prepared to fish elsewhere for new students, you needed the scheme to be running in a pretty big church. Not many were. What I've just mentioned may be sufficient reason to explain the demise, not only of the 5 that had closed when I surveyed them, but of others since. However, I can't help thinking that the whole welcome development, now aided by modern electronic communications, of blended learning schemes, which enable a student to spend part of their time in their local context, and another part, often intensively, attending Bible college, also played a role in the reversal of the former trend. While I was at RTC, we developed what we called open learning, which involved students attending RTC on an occasional Friday and sometimes Saturday for an intensive day or 2 of lectures, but otherwise being back home and studying there. This was, of course, before the days of online learning as such, and students communicated with us and each other by email, which had come along by then, but it was still very cumbersome in comparison. Whether the open learning of my day played any part in the ancestry of RTC's present context-based learning, I don't know, but I am very glad that this general approach continues today. Long may such schemes last. Another thing, the second of the 2, that came and went during my 40 years at Bible College, or more accurately, diminished to a degree, and this might surprise you, is my enthusiasm for academic study. I think I never got sucked into the vortex of academic study for its own sake. I've always subscribed to RTC's currently advertised motto of head, heart, and hands. Really like that. But I've seen great changes in my attitude. You know, my initial approach to university level study was highly functional and vocational, right from my school days. I recall telling people that if I didn't get into medical school, I wouldn't bother to go to university and study something else. Instead, I just looked directly for work on leaving school. Similarly, when I felt called to the ministry, I was so fired up that I would have started the next day if Elim had allowed it. But as I was still in my 20s, I was told that I had to do a minimum of 2 years at EBC, grinding my teeth in frustration over what I felt would be 2 wasted years. I went, and I loved it. By the way, I wasn't the only student who had their doubts about the value of Bible college. A fellow student lamented once, I remember it well, "Why do we have to write all these essays? We'll never have to write another essay after we're out of this place." But I quickly, back then as a student, saw that actually essay writing and sermon construction, for example, have quite a lot in common. And one is a useful preparation for the other. Not to mention the whole backbone of theology, more on that later, that I was being equipped with. My next taste of academic study was self-initiated. In 1990, I think it was, I became UK director of IBIOL. And this involved mixing with leaders and lecturers from other Bible colleges. And I quickly realized that if I was, so to speak, to keep up with their understanding and expertise, I needed more under my belt than the diploma of religious studies that I'd come out of EBC with. I took a year out from full-time ministry at Kensington Temple and did a master's degree at London Bible College, which again, I loved. Over the years after that, through various factors, I was encouraged to publish, which I found fulfilling, and I thoroughly enjoyed lecturing, searching. I found all this immensely satisfying, and I took to it like a duck to water. When in 2004, slightly burnt out from being RTC principal, I engaged in a PhD back in my medical alma mater, Edinburgh University, I adored the experience. So from my beginnings as someone who saw study and training as a necessary chore to get into the vocation I was heading for at the time, I switched mid-career to being a lover of academic work in all its forms. However, what I gradually fell out of love with was the long-term immersion in a world of critical thinking. This concern is not only recent. I remember giving a one-off lecture to RTC students as they entered second year on some critical thoughts about critical thinking. But my ennui with the whole approach developed more in recent years. I reached the point, to my frustration, towards the end of my ministry, I'm retired now, by the way, where I was hardly doing any reading at all without being required in some way to offer a judgment on what I was reading. Of course, this involved marking essays, but it was so much more. Many of the longer works I was reading were PhDs I was examining, or books I'd been asked to write reviews for. Also, in my own research and lecture preparation, I had to do the same thing, offering discussion of a work's strengths and weaknesses, whether that was in lecture notes or research papers. As I said a moment ago, I don't think I was ever sucked into the error of forgetting what it was all for, but I fear that such a life can, for some, become an end in itself. That can apply to lecturers, but to students too. So, to a sermon I once gave at LST Chapel, which is what we call the weekly all-community devotions there, I gave the sermon title, Keep the Classroom Close to the Chapel. Even if there are lengthy corridors, or here at RTC, tunnels, between the two, keep the classroom and the chapel close to each other, I preached back then, in your heart and head. Make sure you ask yourself and God how what you're learning in the classroom is affecting your worship and wider relationship with God, and vice versa. I also felt personally challenged. This was quite a sudden thing that came to me, I can remember it. I felt personally challenged to keep the journal close to church and chapel. I reached a point, I can't remember exactly when, but I do recall this happening. I felt worried that the sort of things I was writing about in my research papers and the things I was preaching about were drifting apart. I set myself a challenge. Anything at all that I was researching and writing also had to be preachable. That should be the sort of limits of what I research. And I should preach it. I remember I wrote an article for what used to be called JEPTA, Journal of European Pentecostal Theological Association, on the miraculous element in Lucan missiology. And I remember preaching that round loads of different churches that I was visiting at the time about the miracles in Acts and the part they played in the success of the mission that Luke was describing. If I couldn't preach it, what was the point of researching and writing about it? I found great joy in preaching from the content of my academic research, and it may well be, though I can't remember specifically, that some of my sermons, vice versa, provided inspiration for my research and publishing. And now, retired, I find it a relief and a delight to read books without having to judge them. Of course, I still form opinions about things. I'm a human being, but I don't have to formalize those opinions or communicate them to others, and I don't have to write reports. Yeah, amen, because now, I'm sure the average student realizes this, but marking is not the favorite activity that a lecturer has. You may hate writing the things. Wait till you have to start marking them. So I've looked at two things that came and went. I turn now to things that just kept coming. Again, there are two. The first of them flows straight from where I finished the last section. It's the juggernaut of ever-increasing, if I can use this rather ugly term, academization. When I was a student at EBC, it didn't offer degrees. 1 or 2 students a year studied for a London University BD. A few of us did the Cambridge University external diploma of religious studies, but many, I think the majority, did a non-accredited internal college course. How things have changed. By the time I became principal at what was by then RTC, it was accredited by back then Manchester University to offer its own BA and MA and MTH degrees. Now, as you know, one can leave RTC with a BA majoring in church leadership, performing arts, youth ministry, and RTC is far from alone, as we also know. Various UK Bible colleges offer PhDs. I see no reversal of this overall trend, which is part of a wider societal trend towards, so to speak, degrees in everything. Remember Tony Blair's target that 50% of school leavers should go into university? I think actually we're beginning to see a little bit of pushback against all of that in wider society. So who knows, maybe in time that will roll through in our direction. I don't. I mention the trend because it chimes in with what I was expressing as I reflected on falling in and out of love with academia. High academic standards are good. I do think there is a danger, however, to reflect Revelation 2 verse 4, of losing our first love. The head may gain undue prominence over the heart and the hands. Let us take care. Oh, I haven't got on to recommendations yet. These are just reflections. All right, it's a bit disorganized, never mind. The other thing that has kept coming, and which I warmly welcome, and giving a lecture here hosted by the IPT, is the development and influence of Pentecostal theology as a subject area and a set of methods in its own right. Again, when I studied first at EBC in the 80s, as far as I recall, we learnt a bit of Pentecostal history just within a wider module on what was called modern church history, basically an act from the Reformation. We had early church history, and then we had a huge gap, which is just called the Dark Ages or something. I don't know. And then, is that right? And then we started modern church history. No, I think there was Reformation church history. There was Reformation church history as well. I can't remember when modern church history started. Anyway, there was some little, I don't know, a couple of weeks on Pentecostal history. I can't really remember. But there was nothing at all, as far as I can remember, called Pentecostal theology at a Pentecostal Bible college. We just learnt systematic theology of a fairly generic Protestant hue. To be fair, it might be argued, and argued well, that all of what we learnt was from a Pentecostal perspective. But that's not the same as actually distilling out what methods and content form a Pentecostal theology. I'm glad to say that we introduced at RTC, while I was a lecturer, the undergraduate modules, Introduction to Pentecostal Theology and Studies in Pentecostal Issues. I'm glad too for the countless books that have been written and book series launched developing Pentecostal theological content and methods. I'm glad on a personal level that while I was working at LST, my job title changed from Senior Lecturer in Pentecostal and Charismatic Studies to Senior Lecturer in Pentecostal Theology. We Pentecostals, it took us a while to realize this. We Pentecostals have theology. We have nothing to be ashamed of. The third area of my reflections, we looked at things that came and went, things that stayed the same. Things that kept coming, and now things that stayed the same. Well, number one, RTC is still here. Now, 100 years later, when I say here, here is not Capel in Surrey, where I was at EBC when I studied. Here is not Nantwich. But I rejoice seriously in RTC's continued existence. That cannot be said for every Bible college. I have witnessed the demise, albeit sometimes cloaked as restructuring, of too many. I was going to list them, but decided that was unfair. Simply take it from me that for a Bible college to celebrate 100 years is really quite something. Furthermore, RTC still offers campus-based learning as well as context-based. I believe I'm up to date with that piece of information. I hear you say, well, Baldwin, in my initial excitement about open learning all those years ago, I predicted to my colleague Peter Davis that it would soon take over from residential studies. Oh no, he said, there will always be a place for residential courses. So far, at least, he's been proved right. Another of my predictions gone wrong. Some other things that have stayed the same are not so welcome. I've seen from various vantage points the difficulties that surround university validation of degrees. I've spoken with the leaders of colleges in other European nations who've lamented the sheer cost of validation, or the fact that some validating universities demand that courses be examined in English. I've seen a university withdraw its validation from a college. I've seen a university with many, many validation partners go under, causing various degrees of panic among their validated colleges and concern among all the others. Will it be our university next? I've seen universities threaten or hint at threats to withdraw validation. The answer some come up with to pursue TDAP, taught degree awarding powers, do it yourself, creates its own mountain of challenges and costs. I don't see any easy answers anytime soon. The poor, Jesus said, you will always have with you. It seems there are other things too that are just always there and have to be managed. C'est la vie. I wouldn't go back to those EBC days of just internal courses, though they could be part of the mix. Anyway, on a cheerful note, I come now to the second half of my talk. I can see a clock, but it's got so many reflections on it, I'm not sure what time it says, and I don't know when I started, so I'll just keep going. Who knows what second half means, you know? I said at the beginning, I wouldn't dare to tell you how to do things. So I see this second half simply as a few thoughts for you to toss around. I also said that I've been told I'm speaking to a somewhat mixed audience, and so I'm going to divide these thoughts into those directed towards Elim training, basically read Michelle, to lecturers and students. As we go along, you'll find that I can't help throwing in a few further reflections among the recommendations, as indeed I've already thrown a few recommendations. So first, what might I hope that Elim training considers? And by the way, when I say Elim training, I mean that broadly, and I definitely include RTC. I firmly believe that Bible college still has a place. Local church-based schemes have not taken over, whatever I might have predicted back in 1998 when I published that article. Not everyone in Elim has seen it that way. I recall being in a meeting many years ago with the team at the time of Elim's regional superintendents, now called regional leaders, and hearing one of them, to my intense dismay, saying that he didn't understand why Elim even had a Bible college. Something like that anyway. I might have exaggerated the wording in my memory, but I don't think I'm making that up ex nihilo. I do hope that person has altered their view of things somewhere along the line. It's worth remembering that 100 years ago, George Jeffreys believed Elim needed a Bible college. According to somebody called Altwyn Jones, Jeffreys stated at the time that, quotes, Elim's progress had been greatly hindered by the lack of such training facilities. I am sure that I am one of many, many Elim ministers who are intensely and immensely grateful for the education, training, and input that we receive from this institution. It's a good place. I believe that Elim was right and I was wrong back in 1985 when I wanted to charge straight into ministry with only my local church experience for training. And they insisted that I spend 2 years at EBC. Equally, I'm sure that I stand among countless people who are grateful for a similar input from LBC, now LST, London School of Theology. By the way, RTC owes a lot to LST because when I came here in 97 as principal, half the faculty had been trained at LST. And I added to that number, having done a master's, the one-year master's there myself. I appreciate that the traditional roles of Bible colleges can be justifiably challenged. While I worked at RTC, Keith Warrington published an article in the Journal of the European Pentecostal Theological Association, JEPTA, with the provocative title, the superb title, Would Jesus have sent his disciples to Bible college? Oh, I feel like saying, ouch. His answer to the title's question, I quote, for discipleship training, no. For refresher courses, revolving door experiences, oases for reflection, stimulation, and discussion with others who are asking similar questions, yes. The reason he was cautious about recommending, and he was one of the faculty, the reason he was cautious about recommending Bible college as a place for discipleship training was something he had made clear earlier in the article. To quote him again, some length, training for ministry and discipleship is different to academic theological education. We could try to harmonize the routes to each, he wrote, but that is a doomed exercise with neither group being benefited fully. Degrees can lead to rationalism, not to radicalism. Nice wordsmithing here. Learning rather than learned behavior. Libraries, not lifestyles. End quote. I'm not convinced that this stark contrasting between the two is necessary. It is not true to my experience as a student. At diploma, master's, or doctoral level, I well remember writing my doctoral thesis, for example, an experience at times of intense worship. So, not in full agreement with Keith, I feel more comfortable with another colleague's, Neil Hudson's assessment in an article published bang next to Keith's with the more cumbersome title, sorry, Neil, It's Not What We Do, It's the Way That We Do It. Uncomfortable Thoughts for a Lecturer in a Bible College at the Turn of the Century, end title. At one point in his article, he seemed to go further than Keith. He wrote, "It is my belief that in an ideal world, church-based training is the most appropriate place for both theological reflection and ministerial preparation to take place." Again, I say, he was a faculty member. Are these guys traitors? However, and I dare say that he was reading this world as not ideal. He saw a collaborative combination rather than stark contrast between academic study and discipleship and ministry training, between Bible colleges and local churches. Again, I quote, "Bible colleges will continue to be in existence, but need to be reintegrated with the churches. The competitive element, often discernible, does not reflect the spirit of Ephesians 5. And colleges need to be places of Pentecostal formation." With one eye on the burgeoning local schemes of the day, he concluded, "Perhaps the advent of church-based training schemes is the spur to action that was needed to bring colleges back into a place where they can be focused on the church, servants of the church, and prized by the church." Perhaps the best thing I can say, William, in response to that is here. 100 years on from the college's founding, I very much hope that Elim, its national departments and areas, its churches will continue to prize RTC, and that RTC will prize Elim. I'm delighted to see that when to check my facts, I Googled Elim training. There were references to a school of worship, to the Limitless Academy, to Elim online training, but I'm delighted also to see, sitting among these, reference to RTC. My hope that Elim will prize RTC and vice versa leads well to my second recommendation to Elim training. During my reflections, I spoke about keeping the classroom close to the chapel and the chapel close to the classroom. Now I also want to say, keep the college close to Elim. Not that they're separate entities. I appreciate there's a slight difficulty in my wording, forgive me. And Elim close to the college. When I was appointed as RTC's principal in 1997, there was something of a concern amongst Elim's national leadership that the college might have drifted somewhat from its Elim moorings in the preceding few years. This feeling easily centered around the then very recent name change from Elim Bible College to Regent's, what's that? Sorry, but Theological College. I well remember being asked by Julian Ward, a faculty member at the time, soon after I came to the college, whether I would be changing the name back again. I was certain that this would not be a good idea. But I did sense that my boss, Wynne Lewis, wanted me to keep the path between Elim and its college very short. The first two, I was delighted to do so. It's what I believed in. I developed a fourfold vision statement soon after I arrived at the college. And the first two parts of this were that RTC should be and be increasingly, number one, robustly Pentecostal, and number two, wedded to Elim and its vision. I have not changed my viewpoint. I know that these days, a Bible college has to face in several directions. One has to keep one's validating university happy. I touched on those challenges earlier. One has to keep the office for students on side. And if one takes overseas students, the whole issue is that much more complex. One has to look over one's shoulder at what other Bible colleges are up to. I used to hate the fact at LST, I don't remember this from RTC, LST, my colleagues there would talk about the competition. I wanted to say we're not, I did say sometimes, but I just got shouted down. It's not the competition, we're fellow workers in the same vineyard. But unfortunately, just as there may be a sort of competitiveness between college and church that Neil Hudson referred to in his article, so too, there can be this competitiveness between the colleges, each after the one potential student. Maybe some of you, when you were looking where to apply, felt that from them, I don't know. So we may have to look in many different directions as colleges, but I hope RTC will keep its primary focus on Elim, its ethos, its ministry, and its vision. Okay, let's turn our attention now to my second set of recommendations, this time to lecturers. I will at this point begin to sound rather repetitive. Perhaps it's because I think this is important. If I say it often enough, I might get heard. Lecturer, keep the classroom close to the chapel. Keep an eye, a firm, focused eye, on Christ's commission to the church as you write curricula, design modules, and prepare lectures. Perhaps you might want to remember what I said about keeping the journal close to the chapel. I found it fulfilling, and I will say this to the editor of the Journal of International Charismatic Christianity. I may even have got the name they used. What used to be JEPTA. Keep the journal close to the chapel. I found it fulfilling to rise to the challenge of preaching on what I was writing academically. You might find the same if you choose to take a leaf out of my book. Secondly, lecturers, please continue to develop Pentecostal theology as a discipline. I know I'm preaching to the converted. It's bound to happen. Delight in it and in its distinctive emphases and methods. For example, in hermeneutics. Do not merely respond to other theological approaches, which I think was rather a weakness in early Pentecostal theology. For example, I wrote and later published my MA dissertation reviewing the many Pentecostal responses to James Dunn's, the late James Dunn's, influential doctoral thesis on baptism in the Spirit. Those various Pentecostal responses that I reviewed in my MA dissertation were all good, and that process is all well and good. But we're called not merely to respond to the initiatives of non-Pentecostal theologians. There is more virgin territory to cross as well. To give an example, I think that there is a distinctive Pentecostal response that can be mounted to today's environmental crisis, which is, I think, one of the greatest existential challenges that humanity faces today. That's just my opinion on it. But I do think that there is a distinctive Pentecostal response to that issue, that set of issues. And perhaps too, to modern slavery. There'll be many others, of course. And in your development of Pentecostal theology, please hear this loud and clear. I may regard this as one of the most important things I say this afternoon. Please do not lose true theology to that closely related subject, religious studies. I see religious studies as essentially a branch of anthropology, the study of humans, not God. In other words, it is a study of human religious behavior. And I'm sorry to say that it's possible to study religious studies, engage in religious studies without any reference at all to any notion of God. There has been a tendency, including among Pentecostals, to write more Pentecostal history than theology, and for that history to be written as a human story and only a human story. Pick up various Pentecostal histories, have a look, see for yourself if that's the case. Our history is important and deserves to be written. God played a part in that history. And there are other subjects, but church history is one of those things that sits on the cusp between theology and religious studies. And it's up to you, the researcher, the writer, the teacher, the author, which way you lean. History is only one example of the tendency I see to limit Pentecostal inquiry to religious studies. They have their place, but we need theologians, people who dare to look up, who seek to glimpse God. I used in my lectures to talk about gazing at God, and then I felt God tick me off. You don't get to gaze at me, chump. There's a place somewhere in the Bible that says no one can see God. I changed my language to glimpse God, as God chooses to reveal. There are glimpses to be had, and the day will come. We only see through a glass darkly. The day will come when we will see face to face, and we will know fully, even as we are fully known. God has revealed the divine self in the person and history of Jesus Christ. Of course, Jesus studies are one area which I've engaged in a lot, where famously anthropological history tends to win against genuine theology. But it is, paired as it should be with Christology, the place where true theology should thrive, because that is the place in human history where God has revealed in Christ. Also, another plea, having engaged in Trinitarian research, in our Trinitarian studies, Pentecostals should roundly challenge the functional binitarianism, you can work out what that word means if you've never heard it before, of some theologians. There's a lot of binitarians around, and it's always the Holy Spirit who gets missed out, just in case you haven't worked that one out. And so, as my talk begins to draw to a close, I turn to the group without whom there would be no RTC, no Bible colleges, no Donald G. lectures, no lecturers' jobs. To our wonderful students, what do I have to say to you by way of recommendations? Perhaps by now you can guess what's coming first. Keep the chapel close to the classroom. In John 5:39-40, we read Jesus saying, and thank you, Alison, for pointing me to this text in this context, "You diligently study the scriptures because you think that by them you possess eternal life. These are the scriptures that testify about me. Yet you refuse to come to me to have life." The scriptures, students, can be diligently studied, as can church history, theology, other religions, practical skills, the whole curriculum. And Jesus can be missed. An absolute tragedy. Students, is Jesus your teacher? Who's standing up in front of you during those lectures? Is Jesus your teacher? What is he teaching? This is a question to ask yourself every day. Another word of advice I would offer is that you value formal study and its outcomes. Of course, on one level, you wouldn't be here unless this was already true. But I've watched too many students, once they are busy, tired, pressurized, and stressed, see their studies as the problem, lectures as a chore, essays as a burden, exams as anathema, the minimum as the thing to be got away with. No, be a maximalist. It's worth it. I've always remembered something Colin Dye said while he was ministering at Kensington Temple. He said that the sermons we preach, the pastoral counsel we offer, the interactions we have with our flocks are the outward flesh and skin of our ministry. They're what people see. That our theology is the underlying skeleton. Much of the time, Colin said, or left us to work out, I can't recall, much of the time, like a skeleton, it does not show on the surface. Don't try to blind people with erudite theological niceties. Let it not show, like a skeleton. But it is the thing that gives our ministry its shape. Without our skeletons, I'm back to medicine. Our bodies would be hopeless lumps of flesh and we would not survive. Similarly, my other boss at Kensington Temple, Wyn Lewis, used to say repeatedly, if you stop reading, you forfeit your right to minister. In other words, our reading, our study, is that vital, necessary undergirding to the superstructure of ministry that we do. For you privileged to study at Bible college, now is the time you can pack in a lot of that reading. Over the many years in which I've been involved, I've heard countless students say to me, you know, once I've finished at college, I'll really have the time to read ... with some book being mentioned. I've always encouraged the opposite approach. It's during one's formal studies that one is privileged with time and focus for reading that one rarely gets at other points in life. So for my last part. Finally, dear students, enjoy it. Enjoy being a Bible college student. Yes, you can easily list the things you could do without, the things that tempt you to complain, but it's good. And I tell you in closing that I found studying at Bible college, both when I did my initial diploma at EBC, and then when I studied for my master's at LBC, I found that studying at college was an absolute holiday compared to the challenges and sheer busyness of being first a junior doctor. So this is before modern legislation about junior doctor's hours, and then later junior minister. So enjoy this holiday. It may be the best one you ever get.